The mahogany secretary desk sat in the corner of the Riverside Museum's restoration wing, its brass handles catching the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. I ran my fingers along its weathered surface, feeling the grain of wood that had witnessed decades of stories. The curator's voice echoed behind me, discussing insurance valuations with the board members, but I barely heard the numbers. What mattered was the way Dr. Helena Marchetti's eyes had widened when she first saw my collection. What mattered was the silence that followed when she whispered the words that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Vasquez, and for 26 years, I had been the family disappointment. Not in the dramatic way that makes for interesting dinner conversation, but in the quiet, persistent way that wears you down like water on stone. While my sister Natalie pursued her MBA, and my brother Marcus climbed the corporate ladder at our father's investment firm, I spent my weekends haunting estate sales, flea markets, and dusty antique shops in the forgotten corners of Sacramento. The obsession started innocently enough. At 15, I discovered a Victorian mourning locket at a garage sale, its black enamel surface cracked but still beautiful. The elderly woman selling it barely glanced up from her crossword puzzle when she took my $5. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph of a young woman, her eyes holding secrets I would never know. That night, I researched mourning jewelry until my eyes burned, learning about hairwork and memorial customs, about love that persisted beyond death. It was the first time I felt connected to something larger than myself. My family's reaction was predictable. Mom worried I was becoming morbid. Dad suggested I channel my energy into something more practical, like business school. Natalie, already in college, rolled her eyes and called it my weird phase. Marcus, 3 years older and convinced of his own importance, dubbed my finds Elena's junk collection, and the name stuck. Even now, at family gatherings, he would gesture toward whatever vintage piece I wore and announce to whoever would listen that his little sister had questionable taste in old things. But I kept collecting. Through community college, through my job at the local library, through the endless stream of family criticism that followed me like a persistent headache. I learned to recognize the difference between reproduction and authentic pieces, developed an eye for quality that had been overlooked or misunderstood. A Bakelite bracelet dismissed as cheap plastic, a mid-century ceramic vase labeled as garage sale fodder, a Depression-era glass bowl that someone's grandmother had used for Sunday salads, not knowing it was crafted by a master artisan. My one-bedroom apartment became a careful museum of forgotten beauty. Every surface held something rescued from obscurity. Art Deco cigarette cases lined my windowsill, their silver surfaces reflecting rainbows. A collection of vintage fountain pens rested in a display case I'd found at a thrift store. Hand-embroidered linens, too delicate for daily use but too lovely to hide, draped over furniture I'd restored myself. The criticism intensified as I got older. Why didn't I have a real career? Why was I wasting money on old things when I could be saving for a house, a car, a future that looked like everyone else's version of success? The questions came wrapped in concern, but they carried the weight of disappointment. At every birthday, every holiday, every family milestone, the conversation inevitably turned to my life choices, my priorities, my apparent inability to grow up and join the adult world of mortgages and investment portfolios. The breaking point came last Christmas. We were gathered in my parents' spacious home in Fair Oaks, the kind of place where every room was professionally decorated and nothing had a story beyond its price tag. I had worn a 1940s emerald cocktail dress that I'd found at an estate sale the month before, carefully altered to fit my frame. The beading was intact, the color rich as jade, the craftsmanship evident in every seam. I felt beautiful in it, connected to the woman who had worn it decades before, to parties I could only imagine. Marcus noticed it first, of course. He was holding court near the fireplace, bourbon in hand, regaling his wife and some family friends with stories from his latest business trip. His eyes landed on my dress and his mouth curved into that familiar smirk. "Look who's playing dress-up again," he announced, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Elena's channeling her inner ghost. "What dead person are you impersonating tonight, sis?" The laughter was polite but cutting. I felt my cheeks burn as heads turned, taking in my vintage ensemble with expressions ranging from amusement to barely concealed pity. Mom shot Marcus a warning look, but her smile was strained. Dad continued his conversation about quarterly projections as if nothing had happened, his practiced ability to ignore uncomfortable moments on full display. "It's a beautiful dress," I said quietly, but my voice was lost in the resumed chatter. "Beautiful and creepy," Natalie chimed in, her own designer outfit a stark contrast to my carefully chosen vintage pieces. "Elena, honey, you know there are actual stores that sell new clothes, right? Clothes made for living people." The room erupted in laughter again, and I felt something inside me crystallize into resolve. I had spent years absorbing their mockery, letting their words chip away at my confidence like acid on metal. I had defended my passion in small ways, tried to explain why these objects mattered to me, why they represented more than just old things gathering dust. But I had never been able to articulate the true value of what I collected, the historical significance they dismissed so easily. That night, lying in my childhood bed surrounded by the sterile perfection of my parents' guest room, I made a decision. I would prove them wrong. Not through argument or explanation, but through action. I would show them that my eye for forgotten treasures was more than just a quirky hobby. I would demonstrate that the pieces they mocked as worthless junk were actually valuable contributions to preserving history. The Riverside Museum had been on my list of potential contacts for months. Their collection focused on regional history, with particular emphasis on domestic arts and crafts from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I had visited their exhibitions countless times, studying their displays, noting the gaps in their collection where my pieces might fit. Dr. Helena Marchetti, the chief curator, had given a lecture at the library the previous spring about the importance of preserving everyday objects that told the stories of ordinary people. Her words had resonated with me deeply, confirming what I had always felt but struggled to express. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to call. Another week to arrange the appointment. Dr. Marchetti's assistant was polite but businesslike, explaining that the museum received many donation offers, but could only accept pieces that met specific criteria for historical significance and authenticity. I assured her that I understood, though my heart hammered against my ribs as I imagined my beloved collection being dismissed as readily as my family dismissed it. The morning of the appointment, I loaded my car with carefully selected pieces. Not everything, just a representative sample that showcased the range and quality of my collection. The secretary desk was too large to transport, so I brought photographs and documentation I had compiled over the years of research. Each piece was wrapped in archival tissue, protected in custom-made boxes that I had crafted to prevent damage during transport. Dr. Marchetti met me in the museum's loading dock, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. She was smaller than she had appeared during her lecture, but her presence filled the space around her. She introduced herself with a firm, "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Handshake and led me through a maze of corridors to the restoration wing, where natural light flooded through skylights and workbenches held treasures in various stages of conservation. "Show me what you've brought," she said simply, pulling on white cotton gloves. I began with the mourning jewelry collection, pieces that spanned 3 decades of Victorian grief customs. Lockets containing braided hair, brooches made from jet and vulcanite, memorial rings engraved with dates and initials worn smooth by time. Dr. Marchetti examined each piece with growing attention, turning them in the light, checking hallmarks and construction techniques with a jeweler's loupe. "Where did you find these?" she asked, her voice neutral but focused. I told her about the estate sales, the antique shops, the patient years of searching and learning, how I had studied period photographs to understand how the pieces were worn, researched the symbolism embedded in their designs, connected them to the broader cultural practices of their era. She listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification about provenance or condition. Next came the ceramics, art pottery from local California artisans, whose work had been overshadowed by larger, more commercial producers. Pieces by Adelaide Alsop Robineau, whose crystalline glazes had pushed the boundaries of American ceramics. A rare Newcomb College vase, with its distinctive moss-draped oak motif. Tiles by Ernest Baxkelder, that had once graced the fireplace of a Pasadena bungalow before the house was demolished to make way for a shopping center. Dr. Marchetti's composure began to crack. She picked up the Batchelder tiles with reverence, tracing the raised designs with her fingertip. "Do you know what these are?" she asked. "Batchelder produced them between 1909 and 1916, I replied. He was part of the arts and crafts movement, believed that handmade objects could counter the dehumanizing effects of mass production. These particular tiles show his signature peacock motif, which he adapted from medieval manuscript illuminations. She set the tiles down carefully and looked at me with new attention. "How long have you been studying this?" 11 years, seriously. Longer if you count just loving old things. The textiles came next. A quilt made by a Sacramento seamstress in 1894, its pattern documenting a family's westward journey in appliqued scenes. Vintage clothing that represented decades of changing fashion and social expectations. A collection of samplers embroidered by young girls learning needlework, their imperfect stitches telling stories of education and domestic expectation. With each piece, Dr. Marchetti's questions became more detailed, more probing. She wanted to know about condition, about repairs I had made or avoided, about how I had stored and preserved each item. Her expertise was evident in every inquiry, but so was her growing excitement. I could see it in the way her movements became more animated, in the quickening pace of her examination. The final piece was a photograph album from the 1920s, its pages filled with images of Sacramento families during the Jazz Age. I had found it at an estate sale, abandoned in a box of miscellaneous papers. The family depicted was well-dressed and prosperous, their clothes and automobiles suggesting comfortable middle-class status. But what made the album extraordinary were the handwritten captions, providing names, dates, and context that transformed anonymous faces into historical documentation. Dr. Marchetti opened the album and became very still. She turned pages slowly, reading the captions, studying the faces, occasionally pausing to examine clothing or background details more closely. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. "Helena," she said, using my name for the first time. "Do you understand what you have here?" I had researched the album extensively, cross-referencing the family names with city records and newspaper archives. "The Hartwell family," I replied. Charles Hartwell owned a successful lumber business. His wife, Margaret, was active in local women's organizations. Their daughter, Catherine, became one of the first female attorneys in Sacramento County. "This is more than family history," Dr. Marchetti said quietly. "This is social documentation of a crucial period in California's development. The clothing, the automobiles, the domestic settings, they provide insight into how prosperity was lived and displayed during the 1920s. And the fact that you've preserved not just the images but their context makes this incredibly valuable for researchers." She closed the album and removed her gloves, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. For a long moment she said nothing, and I felt my heart sink. I had been foolish to think my collection could measure up to museum standards. I was just an amateur with good intentions, not a serious collector or scholar. "Helena," she said finally, "I need to call the board of directors." My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry if I wasted your time. I know these aren't museum quality." "Stop," she interrupted. "You don't understand. These pieces collectively, they would fill significant gaps in our permanent collection. The mourning jewelry alone would anchor an exhibition on Victorian death culture that we've been planning for 2 years. The ceramics represent local artisans whose work we've been trying to acquire for decades. And this photograph album, it's a treasure trove of social history." The words hit me like a physical force. I had to sit down, my legs suddenly unsteady. "You mean they're actually valuable?" Dr. Marchetti smiled for the first time since I had arrived. "Helena, you have an exceptional eye and clearly a deep understanding of historical context. Some collectors focus on monetary value, others on aesthetic appeal, but you've developed something rarer, a sense of historical significance. You see the stories these objects tell about the people who made them, owned them, used them. She walked to her desk and pulled out a thick folder. I'm going to propose something unprecedented to our board. Rather than accepting these as individual donations, I want to acquire your collection as a single archival unit. We would call it the Vasquez Collection of Domestic Arts and Social History. You would be credited as the collector and researcher, and we would work with you to develop educational materials and exhibitions based on your work. I stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. The Vasquez Collection. My name on museum placards. My research contributing to scholarly understanding. It was beyond anything I had imagined possible. There would be financial compensation, of course, she continued. Based on preliminary assessment, I estimate the fair market value at somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000. But more importantly, your work would contribute to preserving regional history for future generations. The number meant nothing to me. What mattered was the validation, the recognition that my passion had substance and value, that the pieces I had rescued from obscurity would find permanent homes where they would be studied, appreciated, and preserved, that the stories I had uncovered would continue to be told long after I was gone. Dr. Marchetti continued talking about logistics, about appraisal processes, and board meetings, but her words seemed to come from a great distance. I was thinking about my family, about the years of mockery and dismissal, about Christmas dinner, and Marcus's sneering comments about dead people's clothes. I was thinking about proving them wrong in a way that would leave no room for argument or rationalization. 3 days later, the call came. The board had unanimously approved the acquisition. They wanted to announce it at their annual gala, a formal event that drew collectors, scholars, and patrons from across the region. They wanted me to speak about my collecting philosophy and research methodology. They wanted to celebrate the addition of the Vasquez collection to their permanent holdings. I called in sick to work and spent the day walking through my apartment, seeing my collection with new eyes. These pieces that had been dismissed as junk, mocked as the obsession of someone who couldn't let go of the past, were about to become part of an institution dedicated to preserving history. The irony was too perfect to ignore. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not an email, but an actual letter on cream-colored stationery that had belonged to a long-dead Sacramento socialite. I used a vintage fountain pen, one of the pieces from my collection that would soon have a new home. The ink flowed smoothly across the paper as I chose my words carefully. The letter was an invitation to the museum gala, a formal request for my family to join me as I was honored for my contribution to regional historical preservation. I mentioned the financial value of the donation, the significance of having a collection named in my honor, the scholarly recognition of my research. But mostly I wrote about vindication, about the moment when dismissed passion becomes acknowledged expertise. I mailed the letter the next morning, using a vintage stamp from my collection. It seemed fitting that this message of triumph should be delivered through the postal system that had carried so many important communications throughout history. I imagined the letter arriving in my parents' mailbox, being opened with curiosity that would quickly transform into shock. The response came within hours. First, my mother called, her voice bright with excitement and barely concealed pride. Then Natalie, wanting details about the gala and asking if she could bring her husband. Marcus was the last to call, his tone carefully modulated to hide what I knew must be considerable surprise. "Helena," he said, "I had no idea your hobby was so serious. This is really impressive." Hobby. Even now, faced with undeniable evidence of my expertise, he couldn't quite bring himself to acknowledge that my passion had substance and value. But I could hear the respect creeping into his voice, the reluctant admission that his little sister had accomplished something he hadn't anticipated or understood. The weeks leading up to the gala passed in a blur of preparation. Dr. Marchetti introduced me to other curators, scholars who wanted to discuss my research methods and the stories behind specific pieces. I was invited to present a paper at a regional conference on material culture, my first formal academic recognition. The museum's communications department interviewed me for their newsletter, photographing me alongside some of the collection's highlights. Each interaction reinforced what Dr. Marchetti had recognized that day in the restoration wing. I had developed genuine expertise through years of passionate study. I understood not just what these objects were, but why they mattered, how they connected to larger patterns of social and cultural history. My ability to see significance in overlooked pieces wasn't just good luck or intuition, it was the result of serious, sustained scholarship. The night of the gala, I chose my outfit with particular care, a 1930s navy silk dress with intricate beadwork, altered to fit perfectly, vintage jewelry that complemented the dress without overwhelming it, a beaded evening bag that had once belonged to a Sacramento bank president's wife. I looked in the mirror and saw not someone playing dress-up with dead people's clothes, but a scholar who understood and honored the craftsmanship of earlier generations. My family arrived looking sophisticated and proud, their previous dismissiveness replaced by barely concealed awe. The museum was transformed for the evening, its galleries glowing with soft lighting that highlighted the collections. Waiters circulated with champagne and canapés, while a string quartet played period music from various eras represented in the museum's holdings. Dr. Marchetti introduced me to board members, donors, and fellow collectors with obvious pride. She described my work in terms that elevated it beyond hobby or personal interest, positioning it as serious scholarly contribution to regional history. I found myself engaged in conversations about provenance research, conservation techniques, and the challenges of collecting in specialized areas. Marcus and Natalie stayed close, clearly impressed by the respect I was being shown. Mom beamed as she listened to Dr. Marchetti describe my expertise, while Dad asked detailed questions about the financial aspects of the donation, with the focused attention he usually reserved for business discussions. The formal presentation came after dinner. Dr. Marchetti stood before the assembled guests and spoke about the significance of the Vasquez collection, its contribution to the museum's mission, and the exceptional scholarship that had guided its formation. She called me to the podium amid enthusiastic applause, and I looked out at an audience of people who understood and appreciated the work I had been doing in solitude for over a decade. I spoke about the importance of preserving everyday objects that told stories about ordinary people, about how a mourning locket could illuminate Victorian attitudes toward death and remembrance, how a piece of art pottery reflected the democratic ideals of the arts and crafts movement, how a family photograph album documented social mobility and changing cultural values. I explained how these objects, dismissed by many as old junk, actually served as primary sources for understanding historical experience. The applause was sustained and genuine. People approached me afterward with questions and comments, clearly viewing me as an expert worth consulting. My family stood nearby, their expressions ranging from amazement to something approaching respect. For the first time in my adult life, they were seeing me as I had always hoped to be seen, not as the family disappointment who couldn't move beyond childish fascinations, but as someone with genuine knowledge and expertise. Later that evening, as we gathered in the museum's courtyard for final conversations, Marcus approached me with an expression I had never seen before. Gone was the condescending smirk, the automatic dismissal of my interests and choices. In its place was something that looked almost like humility. "Helena," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I never understood what you were doing. I thought you were just buying old things because you couldn't afford new ones, or because you were stuck in the past somehow. I didn't realize you were actually studying, researching, building something important." His words carried weight because they were clearly difficult for him to say. Marcus had built his identity around being the successful sibling, the one who understood how the world worked, who made smart decisions about career and money and status. Admitting that he had fundamentally misunderstood his sister's work was a significant concession. "I've been collecting and studying for over 10 years, I replied. The knowledge didn't develop overnight. Natalie joined the conversation, her designer dress and jewelry looking almost costume-like next to my vintage elegance. "I feel terrible about some of the things I said," she admitted. "I just didn't understand that there was real scholarship behind it. I thought you were just being eccentric." "Eccentric," I repeated, tasting the word. "I suppose passionate scholarship often looks eccentric to people who don't share the passion." Mom and Dad approached, their faces glowing with pride that I hadn't seen directed toward me in years. "Helena?" Mom said, "We're so proud of you. Dr. Marchetti says you're one of the most knowledgeable collectors she's worked with." She thinks you should consider pursuing formal graduate study in museum studies or art history. The suggestion hung in the air like a bridge between my past as the family disappointment and a potential future as the family scholar. Graduate school had never been presented as an option during my community college years, when the focus had been on practical training that would lead to steady employment. But now, with concrete evidence of my expertise and the recommendation of a respected curator, the path seemed not just possible but inevitable. 3 months later, I was accepted into a master's program in museum studies at UC Davis, with Dr. Marchetti serving as an external advisor for my thesis on domestic material culture in early 20th century California. The program offered a graduate assistantship that would allow me to work with their collections while completing my studies. My family's reaction was unanimously supportive, their previous concerns about my impractical interests replaced by enthusiasm for my academic prospects. The transformation was complete, but not without irony. The same family members who had mocked my vintage finds now bragged to their friends about my museum donation and graduate school acceptance. Marcus introduced me at social gatherings as his sister, the collector and scholar, conveniently forgetting his years of dismissive comments. Natalie asked for my advice on antique jewelry, suddenly interested in adding vintage pieces to her wardrobe. But the most meaningful change was internal. The validation I had sought from my family was satisfying, but ultimately less important than the validation I had found within the scholarly community. Dr. Marchetti's recognition of my expertise, the museum's acquisition of my collection, the academic opportunities that followed these, had shown me that passion combined with serious study could indeed lead to respect and accomplishment. Standing in the museum's restoration wing, where my collection was being catalogued and prepared for display, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From a 15-year-old girl buying a mourning locket at a garage sale to a graduate student whose research was contributing to scholarly understanding of regional history. The path had been unconventional, marked by years of family criticism and self-doubt, but it had led to something authentic and valuable. The secretary desk sat in its new home, properly lit and climate-controlled, with a placard identifying it as part of the Vasquez collection. Visitors would read about its provenance, its historical context, its significance as an example of American furniture craftsmanship. They would understand it, as I had always understood it, not as old junk, but as a tangible connection to the lives and stories of people who came before us. My family's laughter had stung because it dismissed not just my choices but my ability to see value where others saw worthlessness. But that same ability to recognize significance in overlooked objects had ultimately proven to be my greatest strength. The vintage finds they had mocked were now museum pieces, my supposed waste of time was now recognized scholarship, and the family disappointment had become the family success story. The vindication was complete, but it came with a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. External validation, whether negative or positive, was ultimately less important than the internal satisfaction of pursuing work that felt meaningful and authentic. The years I had spent collecting, researching, and preserving these objects had been valuable regardless of whether anyone else recognized their worth. The museum acquisition and academic recognition were wonderful, but they were confirmation of value that had existed all along. As I walked through the museum's galleries, seeing my pieces displayed alongside other treasures from the past, I realized that the story wasn't really about proving my family wrong or gaining their respect. It was about the patience required to pursue a vision that others didn't understand, the courage to trust your own judgment when everyone around you suggests you're making mistakes, and the deep satisfaction that comes from contributing something meaningful to the world. The laughter had stopped, but more importantly, I had learned to value my own voice above the chorus of dismissal and doubt. The vintage finds had led to museum donations, but more significantly, they had led to a life built around passion, scholarship, and the preservation of stories that might otherwise be lost. In the end, that was worth more than any amount of family approval or social recognition. It was worth everything. The months following the gala brought changes I hadn't anticipated. Word of the Vasquez collection spread through academic circles, and I found myself receiving invitations to speak at conferences, requests for consultation on similar collections, and inquiries from other museums interested in my research methods. Dr. Marchetti had been right about pursuing graduate studies, but even she seemed surprised by the level of interest my work generated. My apartment, once filled with carefully arranged treasures, now felt eerily empty. The walls bore faint shadows where frames had hung, shelves displayed gaps where ceramic pieces had rested. Only a few personal favorites remained, items I couldn't bear to part with despite their scholarly value. A silver Art Nouveau mirror that had reflected generations of faces, a hand-carved jewelry box with secret compartments, a set of teacups painted with forget-me-nots by a local artist whose name had been lost to time. The emptiness should have felt liberating, but instead it left me restless. For 11 years, hunting for treasures had provided structure to my weekends and purpose to my free time. Now, with my collection established in its permanent home and my academic future secured, I struggled to define what came next. The validation I had craved was deeply satisfying, but it also left a void where constant searching and discovery had once been. UC Davis welcomed me with resources I hadn't dared imagine during my community college years. Access to research databases that revealed provenance information I had spent months tracking down independently. Conservation labs where I could learn proper handling techniques for fragile materials. Faculty members whose expertise spanned everything from American decorative arts to the sociology of collecting. The transition from amateur enthusiast to graduate student required adjustments I hadn't anticipated. Professor Margaret Ainsworth, who would serve as my primary advisor, was known for her exacting standards and theoretical approach to material culture studies. During our first meeting in her office, surrounded by towering bookshelves and framed photographs of archaeological digs, she made her expectations clear. "Helena, you have exceptional intuitive knowledge and impressive practical experience," she said, reviewing my application materials. "But graduate work requires systematic methodology and theoretical framework. You'll need to learn to articulate not just what you know, but how you know it, and why it matters within broader scholarly discourse." The critique stung because it highlighted the gap between my passion-driven collecting and formal academic training. I had developed expertise through years of hands-on experience, but I lacked the theoretical vocabulary and methodological rigor that characterized professional scholarship. My first semester felt like learning a new language while being expected to give lectures in it. The other graduate students came from backgrounds I envied. Art history majors who had studied at prestigious universities, museum studies, students who had completed internships at major institutions, anthropology graduates who understood theoretical frameworks I was encountering for the first time. In seminar discussions, they referenced scholars and concepts with casual familiarity while I frantically took notes and promised myself to look up every unfamiliar term later. But there were advantages to my unconventional path that became apparent as the months progressed. While my classmates could analyze theoretical approaches to material culture, they often struggled to identify or evaluate actual objects. When Professor Ainsworth brought mystery pieces to class for hands-on examination, my years of handling authentic items gave me confidence my peers lacked. I could spot reproduction techniques, recognize period construction methods, and assess condition with accuracy that impressed both faculty and students. The research for my thesis proposal required returning to familiar territory with new analytical tools. I chose to focus on California pottery from the arts and crafts period, examining how local artisans adapted national design movements to regional materials and markets. Many of the pieces I had donated to the Riverside Museum became primary sources for my research, allowing me to combine theoretical analysis with intimate knowledge of specific objects. Dr. Marchetti remained a crucial mentor throughout the transition, helping bridge the gap between my collecting experience and academic requirements. She arranged for me to work with museum registrars, learning proper cataloging techniques and database management. She introduced me to conservators, who taught me to read the stories embedded in restoration marks, wear patterns, and material degradation. Most importantly, she helped me understand that my years of independent research had value within academic discourse, even if it hadn't followed traditional pathways. The financial aspects of my new life required adjustment as well. The museum donation had provided a substantial sum, but graduate school stipends were modest and my library job was part-time. For the first time since beginning my collection, I had discretionary income that wasn't immediately spent on vintage finds. The freedom was simultaneously liberating and unsettling. Shopping for new clothes felt strange after years of wearing exclusively vintage pieces, and furnishing my apartment with contemporary items seemed to contradict the aesthetic principles I had developed over a decade. My family's attitude toward my academic pursuits remained enthusiastically supportive, but their support carried undertones that sometimes irritated me. Marcus now introduced me as his sister, the graduate student, emphasizing my institutional affiliation rather than my expertise. Mom asked repeatedly when I would finish my degree and get a real job, as if my current work was merely an extended form of education rather than a career path. Dad wanted to know about the earning potential in museum work, clearly hoping my success would translate into financial security he could understand and approve. Natalie's interest in my work took a more personal turn. She began asking me to evaluate jewelry and decorative objects she encountered while shopping, seeking my opinion on authenticity and value. At first, I was pleased by her newfound respect for my knowledge, but gradually I realized she viewed my expertise primarily as a tool for her own collecting ambitions, rather than as scholarly work worthy of respect in its own right. The dynamic came to a head during a family dinner in early spring. Natalie arrived wearing what she described as a vintage Cartier bracelet she had purchased at an upscale consignment shop. She asked me to examine it, clearly expecting me to confirm its authenticity and value. I studied the piece carefully, noting several details that raised concerns about its attribution. "The hallmarks don't match Cartier standards from this period," I said gently. "The construction technique is consistent with mass-produced jewelry from the 1980s, not the 1920s piece you were told it was." Natalie's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Are you saying I was cheated? That I don't know good jewelry when I see it?" "I'm saying authentication requires specific knowledge and careful examination," I replied. "It's easy to be misled, especially in high-end consignment markets, where provenance documentation is often incomplete." The tension that followed revealed underlying assumptions about my role within the family dynamic. They were proud of my success, but they expected my expertise to serve their interests rather than challenge their judgment. When my knowledge contradicted their preferences or purchases, they became defensive in ways that reminded me uncomfortably of their earlier dismissiveness. Marcus attempted to mediate, but his comments revealed similar expectations. "Elena's become quite the expert," he said with forced joviality. "Maybe we should start bringing her shopping with us to make sure we're getting authentic pieces." The suggestion reduced my years of study and research to the status of personal shopping service. I understood then that while my family's respect for my accomplishments was genuine, their understanding of what those accomplishments meant remained limited. They could accept that I had expertise, but they struggled to view that expertise as having value beyond their personal benefit. Graduate school provided intellectual stimulation and professional development, but it also highlighted how isolated I had become in my previous life. The years spent researching alone, collecting independently, and defending my interests against family criticism had developed certain habits of mind that served me well in academic work, but made social connections more challenging. I was accustomed to being the expert in any conversation about material culture, the person others turned to for information and analysis. Learning to function as a student again, accepting criticism and guidance from professors, required adjustments to my sense of professional identity. The other graduate students were friendly but focused on their own research projects and career goals. I found it difficult to form close friendships within the program, partly because of age differences and partly because of my unconventional background. They viewed me as an interesting case study rather than a peer, someone whose success story was inspiring but not necessarily relatable. Their casual references to family financial support and undergraduate experiences at elite institutions reminded me of class differences I had tried not to acknowledge during my collecting years. Dr. Marchetti remained my strongest supporter and advocate, but even our relationship required navigation of professional boundaries that hadn't existed during my donation process. As a thesis advisor, she needed to maintain objectivity about my work while continuing to serve as mentor and guide. The dual role sometimes created tensions, particularly when other faculty members questioned research methods or theoretical frameworks she had encouraged me to develop. Professor Ainsworth, despite her initial skepticism about my background, became an unexpectedly valuable advisor as I learned to integrate my practical knowledge with theoretical analysis. She pushed me to question assumptions I had developed through years of hands-on experience, challenging me to support intuitive judgments with documentary evidence and scholarly argument. The process was frequently frustrating, but it ultimately strengthened both my research skills and my confidence in academic settings. My thesis research took me to archives and collections throughout California, documenting the work of arts and crafts period potters, whose contributions had been overlooked by previous scholarship. Many of the pieces I studied were similar to items from my own collection, but examining them within institutional settings required different analytical approaches. I learned to balance aesthetic appreciation with scholarly objectivity, to value objects for their historical significance, rather than their personal appeal. The work was deeply satisfying but also emotionally complex. Each discovery reinforced the validity of my collecting instincts, while simultaneously highlighting how much I still had to learn about systematic research methods. I found pottery by artisans I had never heard of, uncovered documentation that challenged accepted narratives about California craft production, and developed expertise that extended well beyond my original collecting interests. Summer brought opportunities for museum internships and research fellowships that would have been unimaginable during my library employment. I spent 6 weeks working with the collection at the California Historical Society, cataloging ceramics and learning database management techniques that would serve me throughout my career. The experience of handling hundreds of objects in a short period, each requiring careful documentation and analysis, refined my eye in ways that years of individual collecting couldn't match. The internship also provided perspective on institutional collecting that complicated my earlier romantic notions about museum work. I learned about acquisition policies that prioritized certain types of objects over others, often for reasons that had more to do with exhibition potential than historical significance. I witnessed debates about storage space and conservation resources that forced difficult decisions about which pieces deserved preservation and which could be deaccessioned. The realities of institutional collecting were more complex and politically charged than I had anticipated. Working with professional museum staff revealed both the advantages and limitations of my collecting background. My ability to identify and evaluate objects was valuable, but my emotional attachment to pieces sometimes interfered with objective assessment. I had to learn to separate personal aesthetic preferences from professional judgment, to recognize that institutional needs didn't always align with individual collecting priorities. The summer experience clarified my career goals in ways that surprised me. While I had initially imagined working as a museum curator, I discovered that my interests lay more in research and education than in exhibition development and institutional management. The detective work involved in tracking down provenance information, the satisfaction of uncovering forgotten artists and overlooked historical narratives, the process of sharing knowledge with others through writing and teaching these aspects of museum work appealed to me more than the administrative responsibilities that occupied much of curators' time. Fall semester brought advanced coursework in conservation techniques and archival research methods. I learned to read objects as primary sources, extracting information from construction techniques, material choices, and wear patterns that revealed how pieces had been made, used, and valued throughout their histories. The systematic approach to object analysis provided theoretical framework for intuitive skills I had developed through years of handling vintage items. My relationship with my family continued to evolve as my academic work progressed. They remained proud of my achievements, but their pride was often expressed in ways that diminished the intellectual substance of my work. Mom bragged to her friends about my museum donation and graduate school acceptance, but she described my studies as learning about old things rather than conducting historical research. Dad asked about job prospects with increasing frequency, clearly worried that my academic pursuits might not lead to financial stability. The disconnect between their perception and my reality became particularly apparent during holiday gatherings. They wanted to hear about my progress, but their questions focused on external markers of success rather than intellectual development. How many classes was I taking? When would I graduate? What kind of job was I hoping to get? The substance of my research, the theoretical questions driving my thesis work, the scholarly contributions I hoped to make these aspects of my academic life, seemed irrelevant to their understanding of education and career development. Marcus's attitude evolved in ways that were both gratifying and troubling. He had clearly reassessed his earlier dismissal of my interests, and he now spoke respectfully about my expertise and academic achievements. But his newfound respect came with expectations that sometimes felt burdensome. He asked me to evaluate items he encountered in his business dealings, sought my opinion on decorative objects for his home, and referenced my museum donation as evidence of his family's cultural sophistication. My expertise had become part of his social capital in ways that made me uncomfortable. The most significant development in my family relationships came through an unexpected source. My Aunt Patricia, Dad's younger sister, contacted me after hearing about my museum work through family conversations. She had inherited a collection of pottery and textiles from our grandmother, pieces she had stored in her basement for years without knowing their significance. She wondered if I might be able to help her understand what she had and whether any of it might be valuable. The request reminded me of my own early collecting experiences, the excitement of discovery combined with uncertainty about significance and value. I agreed to visit Patricia's home and examine the collection, approaching it with the systematic methodology I had learned in graduate school, rather than the intuitive enthusiasm that had guided my own collecting. What I found in Patricia's basement was a revelation that connected my academic work to family history in ways I hadn't anticipated. Grandmother's collection included pieces by several California potters I was researching for my thesis, items she had apparently purchased directly from their studios during the 1940s and 1950s. More importantly, she had kept receipts, exhibition catalogs, and correspondence that documented her relationships with the artists and her understanding of their work. The discovery transformed my thesis research from academic exercise to personal quest. Grandmother had been a knowledgeable collector whose aesthetic judgment and historical awareness paralleled my own interests in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Reading her correspondence with potters, studying her careful notes about glaze techniques and firing methods, examining pieces she had chosen for their artistic merit rather than commercial appeal, I realized that my collecting instincts might have hereditary as well as experiential origins. Patricia was amazed by my assessment of the collection's significance, both historically and financially. Several pieces were museum-quality examples of work by important but under-recognized California ceramicists. Others provided documentation of artistic techniques and business practices that would be valuable for scholarly research. The collection as a whole offered insight into mid-century collecting patterns and aesthetic preferences that had been largely overlooked by previous scholarship. The ethical questions raised by the discovery were complex and emotionally charged. Patricia was eager to donate the collection to benefit my academic work and family legacy, but she also needed financial resources for her own retirement planning. The pieces were valuable enough to make a significant difference in her economic security, but dispersing them through commercial sale would separate objects from their documentation and reduce their scholarly value. Dr. Marchetti helped navigate this situation by connecting Patricia with museum professionals who could provide official appraisals and explore acquisition options that would benefit both scholarly research and family financial needs. The Riverside Museum expressed strong interest in acquiring grandmother's collection as a complement to my own donation, creating what would essentially become a multi-generational archive of California collecting history. The negotiations took months to complete, involving lawyers, appraisers, tax specialists, and museum board members. Throughout the process, I learned about the complex financial and legal frameworks that governed museum acquisitions, the balance between preserving historical materials and respecting donors' needs, the ways institutional collecting decisions affected both scholarly research and family legacies. More importantly, the discovery of grandmother's collection provided emotional validation I hadn't realized I needed. For years, I had defended my collecting interests against family criticism by arguing for their scholarly and historical value, but I had sometimes wondered whether my passion was simply eccentric obsession dressed up in intellectual language. Learning that my grandmother had shared similar interests and aesthetic judgment, that she had recognized the artistic merit of pieces that later scholarship confirmed as historically significant. This knowledge provided deep personal satisfaction that transcended academic achievement. My thesis research took on new dimensions as I incorporated grandmother's collection, a serious collector and knowledgeable connoisseur whose aesthetic judgment had been validated by subsequent scholarship, but her interests had been dismissed during her lifetime as merely decorative hobbies appropriate for women who didn't need to earn money. The parallels to my own experience were unmistakable and troubling. Reading grandmother's correspondence revealed someone whose intellectual curiosity and scholarly instincts were remarkably similar to my own, but who had been denied opportunities for formal education and professional development because of gender expectations and economic constraints. Her collecting had been serious work disguised as leisure activity. Her aesthetic judgment had been informed by extensive study and research that she pursued independently because institutional resources weren't available to women of her generation. The realization that I had inherited not just grandmother's aesthetic sensibilities, but also her intellectual approaches to material culture, provided both inspiration and cautionary perspective. She had developed genuine expertise that was never formally recognized or professionally rewarded, knowledge that would have been lost entirely if Patricia hadn't preserved her collection and documentation. I had opportunities for institutional validation and academic career development that grandmother had been denied, but I also faced family pressures to abandon scholarly work in favor of more conventional life choices. Spring semester brought doctoral program applications and fellowship competitions that would determine the next phase of my academic career. The process required articulating research interests and career goals with specificity that forced me to confront questions I had been avoiding about long-term professional objectives and personal priorities. My application materials emphasized the unique combination of practical collecting experience and theoretical training that distinguished my background from other candidates. I proposed dissertation research that would expand my thesis work to examine collecting patterns and aesthetic preferences among California women during the early to mid-20th century, using grandmother's collection and documentation as a case study for broader social and cultural analysis. The research proposal generated strong interest from several doctoral programs, particularly those with faculty expertise in material culture studies and women's history. Interview conversations revealed that my combination of hands-on collecting experience, museum work, and family historical materials provided research opportunities that purely academic candidates couldn't access. Dr. Marchetti served as a crucial reference and advocate throughout the application process, emphasizing both my scholarly potential and my unique qualifications for advanced research in material culture studies. Her support carried weight within academic circles because of her reputation as a rigorous scholar and experienced mentor who didn't endorse candidates lightly. Professor Ainsworth's recommendation letter addressed concerns that admissions committees might have about my unconventional background by emphasizing the theoretical sophistication I had developed during graduate studies and the methodological rigor I brought to research questions. Her assessment helped position my practical experience as an asset rather than a liability within academic contexts. The waiting period for admissions decisions provided time for reflection on the journey that had brought me from amateur collector to doctoral candidate in less than 3 years. The transformation had been rapid and sometimes overwhelming, requiring adjustments to my sense of professional identity that I was still processing. The family dynamics that had motivated my initial museum donation continued to influence my academic choices, but they no longer dominated my decision-making process in the same way. My collecting work had begun as a response to family dismissal and social isolation, an attempt to prove that an abandonment of my collecting mission. Instead of rescuing individual objects from obscurity, I would be rescuing historical narratives and cultural patterns from scholarly neglect. Instead of preserving pieces in my personal collection, I would be preserving knowledge through research and publication that could benefit future generations of collectors, curators, and cultural historians. The realization provided renewed motivation for the challenging work ahead, while also helping me process the emotional costs of my career transition. The path from family disappointment to academic success had required sacrificing certain pleasures and relationships that had shaped my identity for over a decade. But it had also opened opportunities for intellectual growth and professional contribution that would have been impossible through collecting alone. Standing in my nearly empty apartment on the eve of leaving for doctoral studies, surrounded by boxes of books and research materials rather than vintage treasures, I felt both excitement and trepidation about the journey ahead. The validation I had sought from my family was finally complete, but it had revealed that their approval was less important than I had imagined. The academic recognition I had gained was deeply satisfying, but it had also shown me that true fulfillment came from work that felt meaningful and authentic rather than from external validation alone. The vintage finds that had once filled my home were now preserved in museum collections, where they would be studied, appreciated, and maintained for generations to come. My role in their stories had evolved from collector to scholar, from individual enthusiast to institutional researcher, from family disappointment to recognized expert. The transformation was complete, but it was also just the beginning of a longer journey toward understanding what it meant to dedicate a life to preserving and interpreting the material traces of human experience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities to contribute knowledge and insight to fields that had been shaped by previous generations of scholars. The path ahead was uncertain but promising, filled with possibilities I couldn't have imagined during those early years of collecting in isolation and defending my interests against family criticism. The laughter had stopped long ago, but more importantly, I had learned to value my own voice and trust my own judgment about what mattered most in both scholarship and life. 5 years later, I stood in the lecture hall at Berkeley, facing a room full of undergraduate students whose blank expressions reminded me of my own family's early reactions to my work. The PowerPoint slide behind me displayed a photograph of a simple ceramic bowl, glazed in muted blues and greens. To most observers, it was unremarkable pottery. To me, it represented decades of scholarship and a complete reversal of everything my family once believed about my life choices. This piece was created in 1923 by Maria Gonzalez, a largely forgotten ceramicist who worked out of her home studio in Oakland. I explained, clicking to the next slide. Until recently, her work was dismissed as amateur craft production, sold at local fairs and church bazaars. But new research reveals that she was experimenting with glazing techniques that wouldn't be recognized by major pottery studios for another 20 years. A student in the front row raised her hand. Professor Vasquez, how do we know this wasn't just accidental? Maybe she didn't understand what she was doing scientifically. The question would have irritated me once, but now I recognized it as an opportunity to challenge assumptions about class, gender, and artistic legitimacy. That's exactly the kind of thinking that has kept women like Maria Gonzalez out of art historical narratives for decades. Her correspondence, which I discovered during my dissertation research, shows sophisticated understanding of chemical processes and intentional experimentation with materials. The dismissal of her work as accidental reveals more about scholarly bias than about her, and documentation into my analysis of California arts and crafts pottery. Her correspondence with artists provided insider perspectives on ceramic techniques and business practices that weren't available in published sources. Her purchasing decisions revealed collecting patterns that challenged assumptions about mid-century taste and market preferences. Her careful preservation of receipts and exhibition materials demonstrated scholarly awareness that paralleled my own research methods. The personal connection to my research subject enriched my academic work in ways that surprised my professors and advisors. Professor Ainsworth noted that my writing gained emotional depth and narrative coherence as I learned to integrate family history with scholarly analysis. Dr. Marchetti observed that my understanding of collecting motivations became more nuanced as I reflected on similarities and differences between my own approaches and grandmother's methods. Winter brought conference presentations and job market preparation that forced me to articulate career goals with greater precision than graduate coursework had required. I discovered that my interests lay primarily in research and writing rather than museum administration or educational programming. The prospect of continuing academic work through doctoral studies and eventual university teaching appealed to me more than curatorial positions at cultural institutions. The decision to pursue doctoral studies rather than immediate employment in the museum field surprised my family, who had assumed that my graduate work was primarily vocational training rather than preparation for continued academic career. They struggled to understand why I would choose additional years of study over stable employment, particularly given my previous financial challenges and delayed career development. Marcus was particularly vocal in his skepticism about my academic ambitions. "Helena, you're 30 years old," he pointed out during a family dinner conversation. Don't you think it's time to start earning real money instead of being a perpetual student? His criticism stung because it echoed doubts I harbored about my own choices. Graduate school had provided intellectual stimulation and professional development, but it had also extended my financial dependence and delayed conventional markers of adult success. The path I was choosing would require several more years of modest income and uncertain career prospects, challenges that seemed increasingly daunting as I approached my 30s. Dad's concerns focused on practical considerations that reflected his business background and traditional views of career development. "What's the job market like for professors?" he asked. "Are you sure you'll be able to find a position after spending all these years in school?" His questions highlighted the risk inherent in academic careers, the possibility that years of specialized training might not lead to stable employment in an increasingly competitive field. University positions in art history and museum studies were limited, and many qualified candidates competed for each opening. The prospect of completing doctoral studies without finding suitable employment was genuinely frightening. Mom's worries took a more personal direction, reflecting her concerns about my social life and family prospects. "Helena, you're so focused on your studies," she said. "When will you have time to meet someone and settle down? Don't you want to have a family of your own?" Her questions touched on sacrifices I had made for my academic work, social connections I had neglected while pursuing research interests, relationship opportunities I had avoided due to financial constraints and time commitments. The single-minded focus that had enabled my collecting success and academic achievement had come at personal costs I was only beginning to acknowledge. But Patricia's discovery of grandmother's collection had also provided perspective on these family concerns that strengthened my resolve to continue academic work. Grandmother had been, my interests had value and significance beyond personal pleasure. The museum validation I had sought was deeply satisfying, but it had also revealed that external recognition, while important, couldn't substitute for internal confidence and self-respect. The academic path I was choosing represented a commitment to scholarship for its own sake, rather than as a means of proving my worth to others. April brought acceptance letters and fellowship offers that confirmed my viability as a doctoral candidate, while also highlighting the competitive nature of academic careers. The choices I faced required careful evaluation of program strengths, advisor expertise, financial support, and geographical preferences. Each option represented different opportunities and challenges that would shape my professional development for years to come. The decision ultimately came down to a choice between prestige and fit, between programs that offered greater name recognition and those that provided better matches for my specific research interests. After extensive conversations with mentors, faculty members, and current graduate students, I chose a program that prioritized intellectual compatibility over institutional reputation, confident that the quality of my work would matter more than the name of my degree-granting institution. My family's reaction to my doctoral acceptance was characteristically mixed, combining genuine pride with persistent concerns about practical implications. They were impressed by the fellowship support and the recognition my work had received, but they continued to worry about career prospects and life choices that seemed to prioritize intellectual fulfillment over conventional success markers. The conversation that defined their response came during a celebration dinner they organized to acknowledge my academic achievements. Marcus raised a toast that captured both their pride and their ongoing ambivalence about my choices. "To Helena," he said, lifting his glass, "who proved us all wrong about the value of old things and is now becoming a professional expert in subjects we didn't even know existed. We're proud of you, even if we still don't completely understand what you're doing." His words were generous and well-intentioned, but they also revealed the persistent gap between their perception of my work and my own understanding of its significance. They could acknowledge that I had achieved success they hadn't anticipated, but they still viewed my academic career as something mysterious and slightly impractical, worthy of respect but not entirely comprehensible. The summer before beginning doctoral studies provided opportunity for reflection on the changes that had transformed my life since that first meeting with Dr. Marchetti. My apartment, once filled with carefully arranged collections, now contained mostly books and research materials. My daily routine revolved around academic deadlines rather than weekend treasure hunts. My social interactions centered on scholarly conversations rather than solitary collecting expeditions. The changes were profound but not entirely comfortable. I missed the excitement of discovery that had driven my collecting years, the satisfaction of rescuing overlooked treasures from obscurity, the tangible connection to past lives and stories that physical objects provided. Academic work offered intellectual stimulation and professional development, but it sometimes felt removed from the direct engagement with material culture that had originally inspired my passion for historical objects. Dr. Marchetti understood these concerns when I shared them during one of our regular mentor meetings. "Helena," she said, "the transition from collector to scholar requires mourning what you're leaving behind as well as celebrating what you're gaining. But remember that your research will help other people understand and appreciate the objects you've spent years learning to see clearly. That's a different kind of preservation, but it's equally valuable." Her perspective helped frame my academic work as a continuation rather than capabilities. After class, I walked across campus to my office in Kruber Hall, passing students who nodded respectfully as they recognized me. The transformation still felt surreal sometimes. The same expertise that had once made me the family eccentric now commanded attention in academic conferences and scholarly publications. My book on women ceramicists of the early 20th century had won 2 major awards and established me as a leading authority in the field. Marcus had called that morning, his voice tight with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. "Helena, I saw the article about your book in the Chronicle. They called you one of the most important emerging scholars in American material culture studies. I still don't entirely understand what that means, but it sounds impressive." His admission of ignorance was progress. For years after my initial museum donation, my family had pretended to understand my work while clearly struggling with its significance. Now they acknowledged their limitations while expressing genuine respect for achievements they couldn't fully grasp. The phone rang as I settled at my desk to review manuscript drafts from graduate students. Dr. Marchetti's voice carried excitement that immediately captured my attention. "Helena, I have news that I think will interest you. We've been contacted by a collector in San Francisco who has a substantial collection of California pottery from the arts and crafts period. She's elderly and wants to place the pieces in an institution, but she's been specific about wanting to work with someone who understands both the artistic and historical significance of the work." My pulse quickened. Despite my academic success, I still felt the thrill of discovery that had driven my collecting years. "What kind of pieces are we talking about?" "From the photograph she sent, it appears to be museum-quality work by several artists you've written about. But here's the interesting part: she specifically requested to work with you because she read your book and felt you understood these ceramicists in ways that other scholars hadn't." The validation was different from anything I had experienced before. Academic recognition from peers was gratifying, but this represented something deeper: connection with someone who shared my appreciation for overlooked artists and understood the passion that drove serious collecting. Mrs. Catherine Liu lived in a Pacific Heights mansion that her late husband had purchased in the 1960s, when his import business began generating substantial profits. She greeted me at the door wearing a silk blouse and pearl necklace, but her eyes held the same intensity I recognized in serious collectors. She was 83 years old and moved slowly, but her mind was sharp and her knowledge extensive. "Professor Vasquez, I've been following your work since your museum donation was announced," she said, leading me through rooms filled with carefully arranged Asian art and California crafts. "Your writing about Maria Gonzalez finally gave academic recognition to an artist I've admired for 40 years." The pottery was housed in a climate-controlled room on the 2nd floor, displayed on custom shelving with museum-quality lighting. As she showed me piece after piece, I realized I was looking at one of the finest private collections of California ceramics I had ever encountered. Work by artists I had spent years researching was represented by their best examples, pieces that revealed technical mastery and artistic vision that had been ignored by mainstream art institutions. "How did you develop such expertise?" I asked, genuinely curious about her collecting history. Mrs. Liu smiled with the same satisfaction I had felt during my early treasure hunting days. "The same way you did, I suspect. Years of looking, studying, making mistakes, learning to trust my eye over other people's opinions. When I started collecting in the 1970s, these artists were completely overlooked. Gallery owners told me I was wasting money on amateur work. Even museum curators dismissed most of these pieces as craft rather than art." Her experience paralleled my own in ways that created immediate understanding between us. We spent hours discussing individual pieces, their provenance, their significance within broader artistic movements, their technical innovations. It was the kind of conversation I had always hoped to have with my family, but had found only within academic and museum circles. "I want this collection to go somewhere it will be properly studied and appreciated," she said as afternoon light faded from the windows. "Your book convinced me that you understand these artists as people, not just as makers of objects. That's rare in academic writing." The donation process took several months to complete, involving appraisals, legal documentation, and institutional negotiations. But unlike my earlier museum experience, this time I participated as a professional colleague, rather than as an anxious amateur seeking validation. My reputation in the field gave weight to my assessment of the collection's significance, and my relationships with museum professionals streamlined the acquisition process. The Liu collection, as it became known, provided material for a major exhibition I curated at the Riverside Museum. The show challenged prevailing narratives about California art history by highlighting women and immigrant artists whose contributions had been marginalized by traditional scholarship. The opening reception drew collectors, scholars, and critics from across the region. My family attended, of course, dressed in their finest clothes and clearly proud to be associated with my success. But their presence was different from earlier celebrations. Instead of bewildered support, they demonstrated genuine engagement with the work on display. Mom spent considerable time reading the wall text I had written, asking questions that showed she was trying to understand the historical context rather than just admire the pretty objects. Dad approached me near the end of the evening, his expression thoughtful. "Helena, I owe you an apology. For years, I thought you were avoiding real work by playing with old things. I didn't understand that you were actually conducting research that would contribute to historical knowledge. This exhibition makes it clear that your work matters in ways I couldn't see before." His words carried weight because they acknowledged not just my success, but the legitimacy of the path I had chosen despite family skepticism. The vindication was complete, but it felt different from the angry satisfaction I had once anticipated. Instead of triumph over their ignorance, I felt sadness about the years of misunderstanding that had separated us. Natalie found me standing before a display case containing some of Mrs. Liu's most exceptional pieces. "Helena, I keep thinking about all those times we made fun of your vintage clothes and old dishes. We were so wrong about what you were doing. This is beautiful and important, and we just couldn't see it." Her admission touched me more than Marcus's reluctant respect or Dad's formal apology. Natalie had always been the family member most dismissive of my interests, the one who had suggested most directly that I was wasting my time and money on dead people's belongings. Her recognition of the exhibition's significance represented a fundamental shift in how she understood both art and scholarship. The success of the Low Collection exhibition led to additional opportunities that established my reputation beyond regional academic circles. I was invited to lecture at major universities, consulted by museums developing similar exhibitions, asked to serve on acquisition committees for institutions building collections in my areas of expertise. But the most meaningful recognition came in a letter from a graduate student at another university, who was beginning her own research on overlooked women artists. She wrote that my work had inspired her to pursue questions that seemed marginal to mainstream art history, and that my example had given her courage to trust her own scholarly instincts despite faculty skepticism about her research interests. Reading her letter, I remembered my own graduate school experience, the challenge of translating passionate collecting into rigorous scholarship, the difficulty of gaining respect for unconventional research methods and subjects. Her words reminded me that academic success carried responsibilities to support others who were following similar paths. 6 months after the exhibition closed, I received an unexpected call from Marcus. His voice was uncharacteristically hesitant, as he explained that he had been asked to serve on the board of a local arts organization and wanted my advice about their collection policies. "Helena, I know this sounds strange coming from me, but I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the exhibition about preserving cultural heritage. My company has been involved in some development projects that might affect historic buildings, and I want to make sure we're being responsible about preservation issues. His request represented a complete reversal of our earlier dynamic. Instead of dismissing my expertise, he was seeking it. Instead of mocking my concerns about historical preservation, he was asking for guidance about incorporating those values into his business decisions. The conversation that followed was the first genuinely collaborative discussion we had ever had about subjects that mattered to me. He listened carefully to my explanations about why certain buildings and objects deserved preservation, asked thoughtful questions about how to balance development needs with historical significance, expressed interest in learning more about the cultural value of places and things his company's work might affect. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the transformation was complete, not just in terms of professional recognition, but in terms of family relationships that had been strained by years of misunderstanding and dismissal. They had finally learned to see me, as I had always hoped to be seen, as someone whose knowledge and passion made valuable contributions to preserving and understanding cultural heritage. The vintage finds that had once provoked their laughter were now displayed in museums where they educated visitors about forgotten artists and overlooked historical narratives. The collecting habits they had mocked as eccentric had evolved into scholarly expertise that was reshaping academic understanding of American material culture. The family disappointment had become the family success story, but more importantly, the work itself had found its proper audience and institutional support. Standing in my office at Berkeley, surrounded by books and photographs that documented years of research, I felt the satisfaction of having proven not just my family wrong, but having contributed knowledge that would outlast all of us. The laughter had stopped long ago, replaced by respect that was both professionally gratifying and personally meaningful. But the greatest vindication was knowing that the artists and craftspeople whose work I had rescued from obscurity would continue to be studied, appreciated, and remembered long after the people who had once dismissed them were forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.